Hey gamers, this is Liz, and I am back from the Reacting to the Past game development conference that I went to this past weekend. So I attended this conference at Cabrini University, which is near Philadelphia, and I got to playtest 3 games. I got to playtest 1492, The Year That Forged Spain. I got to playtest Algeria in Flames, and I also got to playtest a game about 1840s Britain that was pure chaos, but it was a good time. So I had so much fun at this conference. I just want to say, I am so glad that they invited me to be the keynote speaker so I could try a Reacting to the Past game, because truly it was so much fun. So much fun that I very much intend to try either as a Saturday event or as something in maybe my Latin 5 class to get a reacting game played with my Latin students this year. I feel very enthusiastic about the pedagogy. I really learned a lot as a participant. And how much more could I learn if I'd done that in an actual class at some point during my student career? So clearly I'm sold on these games, and I thought that they were really, really, really fun. But I want to talk a little bit more in detail about each of the ones that I played, because they were really quite different, and I played very different roles. And I feel like having that experience gave me a good idea of the variety of reacting games that are out there and the mechanical possibilities that are in them. So the first game I played was 1492, The Year That Forged Spain, and I was Queen Fatima. I was the Dowager Queen of Granada, and so my goal was to help my son hand power over to Ferdinand and Isabel of Spain in a way that was dignified and that didn't lose us too much face. And I also did not want to make any promises that we're going to fully prevent our return in the future, because obviously you have to look out for the future of your family. Just because you lost now doesn't mean that you lost forever. You can come back. So my main activity of the game was trying to help organize a ceremony where we were going to hand the keys to the city over to the Spaniards, and there were people in that committee who wanted to make it about religious triumph. And then my goal was to try to keep it very political. This is between leaders. Yes, we the Muslims lost this time, but that's not a referendum on Islam. And of course, depending on who had ended up on that committee, we could have had a much more brutal fight about it. But fortunately, I managed to persist and get us a fairly political ceremony. I also made the papal representative write a prayer in Latin for me to approve, which was just delightful. I mean, it was a lot of fun. But what's really interesting about this game is that the royalty, so King Mohammed XII and then Ferdinand and Isabel on each side, were royal, and therefore you couldn't just go interact with them. I could go talk to my son because I was his mother, so I had some special abilities within the game to convey information. But a lot of comms in the game were handled through note passing, which was interesting because it opened up the way for espionage, for lying about what was in the notes, for misrepresenting the intentions of the royalty, or for going to the royalty and misrepresenting what somebody else in the room had said. And they were able to kind of overhear snippets of conversations happening around them, but they couldn't directly interact, and they couldn't say, hey, could you repeat that? Because they weren't really supposed to be interacting. So it created this weird but cool situation where the most powerful people in the room were in some ways the most disempowered, and it made all of us have to work to communicate in different ways to make sure that our different sovereigns were getting what they wanted, or that we were getting what we wanted, and maybe putting one over on the boss. And I can see this being such an interesting thing to have play out in a classroom among students. I was really, really into it, and I would 100% try a game like this again. I think what I liked about it especially was that it felt like we were learning history, but it also really did feel like a game because of some of the communication restrictions that we had. And I really enjoyed it. I thought it was clever. I would worry about students maybe colluding outside of class, but I would also try to build in some consequences for that, because So then, that was great. And then the next day, I played a game called Algeria in Flames. So in this one, I was Joey Ortiz. I was Pied Noir. And basically, I was fighting to make sure that the French stayed in control of Algeria and that my interests were looked out for, even though the Algerians were wanting independence. And so it was a really uncomfortable role to play because I was basically racist and colonialist and not very nice. And, within the game, it was a very high possibility that I was about to become a terrorist. I wanted to try to assassinate Charles de Gaulle. I was not a nice person, but I played it up hard, and I ended up having a really good time. And I think that there is something like a little bit delicious about playing a very transgressive role, as long as you're really aware of what you're doing and what that means within the room. So I had a role to play and I played it. It was sometimes uncomfortable. It was sometimes really fun. I had like a PR campaign comprised of very rude memes that I was putting in the Slack. And, it was really interesting to try to put myself into the shoes, the feet of someone that I really would not agree with in life, and somebody who I would have really disapproved of if we met. Somebody who historically, we're not on the same side. But it was very interesting to play that character, partially because it was so counter to what I personally think, believe, and am interested in. It was also interesting because playing somebody who is so, I guess, conservative and so reactionary in that context, it was weird because I didn't feel comfortable, but playing the role was easy because what Joey Ortiz wanted was so straightforward. It wasn't right and it wasn't nice, but it was, I want to be in charge here. This is my land. Everybody else can get out, and I can, it was easy to make memes about it, and it was easy to like state my position and make it sound really obvious because there was no nuance. And I noticed that people who were more nuanced on the other end of the French conversation had a really hard time arguing with me because I had distilled what I wanted into something that was wrong, but that sounded so simple and so right. And I think that that's a really interesting kind of parallel to the way that we do political discourse now. It's very hard to be somebody who wants something nuanced and who is like, well, I don't know about that, because there are so many people who do feel that they know about that and who will just say it, put that meme out there, make that big soundbite statement. And finding myself able to act like that felt easy, but not good. And it was just a really interesting experience to try. So I think people who were on the Algerian side of things had a very different experience of the game than I did, and I would have liked to get to debrief more. I think in a full class we would have gotten to. But that actually was one of the things that made the game very interesting as well. Like, depending on the role you play, your experience of this historical situation will be really, really different. And so I think a lot of debriefing and a lot of talking about that would be really key in a real class where we weren't just playtesting, because it was interesting, and there was a lot more there than I got to see. And then the next day, I played Joseph Fletcher. I was a utilitarian trying to garner support for a universal primary education system. But because it was like a 1840s parliament session, there was so much going on. It was wild. And so in some of the feedback, like, this game may get split into two, or there may be some streamlining, but as it was played, there were a lot of issues going on. So there were issues with the Corn Laws, and there were issues with political parties in parliament, and the other utilitarian cared about sanitation, and that was his special interest. But I wanted to talk about education. That was my character's special interest. There were multiple newspapers, people writing, people who were concerned with Ireland. Basically, there were all these issues going on, and everybody was just screaming for attention and trying to hook up with the right people and trying to make sure the right things happened. And, I thought the game was distracting and, like, hard to, like, get a grip on because of how everything was going on. I also would be willing to say that probably 1840s Britain was, in fact, that confusing and messed up. So, depending on how that game continues to develop, it may turn into a more streamlined experience, but in a way, maybe the chaos probably reflected a real life problem, which was, how do I get Parliament to pay attention to me? How do I get my issue to the center of the conversation when everybody has an issue? That aspect of it was super interesting, and it really made me think a lot about politics and how we do it, especially if you're not already high up and people don't already listen to you. So all three of those games were super interesting experiences. I really enjoyed, like, getting into my roles and playing with other people, and, like, we were funny and, like, made each other laugh within the game, but we were also pretty serious about, like, trying to get our goals met, and it was really cool. And this whole system at this conference was also super interesting. So we would play, and then the person who designed the game had to quietly, with very minimal input, listen to feedback about their game. And then there were at least two people in each of the rooms who were taking notes while feedback was being delivered, so that they could deliver notes to the designer of the game afterwards and give them something to process. And I thought that was a really cool setup, because I think feedback is hard. So major kudos to people who had their games tested here, because they made themselves vulnerable, they laid it out on the line, and then they had to listen to a bunch of talking heads go at it about their game after it was over. Academics like to talk. I feel like I can say that because I am one, like me too, it describes me. But it was an intense feedback round for the people who designed these games. And also, like, major props to the people who were taking notes, because it's a great service to really pay attention for someone else. And I noticed that this ethos also traveled to, like, the pitch sessions for games that may come to exist. People were making sure that there was, like, a good distribution of listeners who would give feedback at every talk, at every pitch. And people were really enthusiastic and really trying to be helpful and, like, help these games develop and come to life. And, you know, what a tough but good situation if you want to get your game tested, if you want to know more about how people are receiving your game. This conference was very, very cool to be a part of, partially because I finally got to experience reacting to the past, partially because I got to see it in that state where maybe things are a little messy, and where you get to see, like, how people are really thinking about these games, how to approach them, how mechanically they should work or could work, parallels to other games that are already published. It was just a really fascinating experience, and I'm super glad that I got to do it. So if you're a teacher out there, or if you're just a really enthusiastic gamer, I don't see why you couldn't pick up a copy of a Reacting to the Past game and give it a try. I think that you'll be really pleased if you fully commit with how it goes, because I was really impressed with what this looked like and felt like when I was in it. And it's an experience that I want to share with my own students this year. So I had a really great conference. It was awesome. Thank you so much for watching, all of you out there. If you have any comments or questions, I'm always interested in hearing it. Thank you so much for watching, and most of all, happy gaming.